Good morning. I've finished with my series of Fisher, and I'm going to start a series on another fantastic run of games. But before doing that, I'm just going to take the opportunity to pay tribute to a British chess player and writer who has broken a world record this week, namely Leonard Barden. As a chess player who's played a great deal in Britain, it's just very, very difficult to overestimate the influence that Barden has had on British chess. The record he broke is this week. He delivered his column to the Guardian newspaper, his weekly column on chess, which I think came out last Friday, so a week ago. And he's been writing that column since 1955, 70 years, longer than I've been alive. And that's a world record for a column. And also, he's written a daily column for the Evening News or even Evening Standard in London, one of the two, which is the longest running daily column in any newspaper anywhere in the world. But he isn't just a newspaper man, he isn't just a newspaper writer, he was a great player, won the British Championship on more than one occasion, and probably would have done even better if he hadn't been forced into deadlines to get his column out. Whatever was happening, he got his column out. Whatever tournament he was playing in, he got his column out. So, you know, great. He actually got the job because he was a young assistant to J. Dumont, who was another great chess writer who wrote the book The Basis of Combination in Chess, which is where I, as a young man, learnt all about combinations and how to play them and, you know, what they were good for. But Dumont sadly had a stroke, and Barden, young as he was, took over as the columnist in the Guardian newspaper, writing a weekly column on chess. But you know, he was also a great chess player. And here's a game from the British Championship in 1959. It's played in York, in England. It's round 3 against Jonathan Penrose, who actually went on to win the championship that year. Barden finished just in 5th place. But, you know, this was a sparkling win against Jonathan Penrose, who became British champion that year. So, Barden, who has white, opens with e4, and we soon get into very familiar territory. It's a Roy Lopez, or Spanish, and on the Norwegian part of my channel, I've been reviewing the Second World Championship match between Chigorin and Steinitz, and this variation, which is now known as the Steinitz variation, was played a great deal. But at the moment we're in the Morphy defence. The bishop retreats and the knight comes out and attacks the pawn. And he defends the pawn on e4 with the rook on e1. Don't tell me the rook isn't on e1. I know it isn't on e1. I'm not blind, but if the pawn is taken, the rook comes to e1, and then if the knight moves, the pawn on e5 is taken. And if he tries to defend the knight, then it gets chased away with the pawn, and the same thing happens. So the rook on e1 defends the pawn on e5, e4, even although the rook isn't on e1. That's just the way it is. And this is the closed variation of the Morphy defence, and the rook now comes to officially defend the pawn on e1 since the pin no longer exists, since the bishop has broken that pin which hasn't yet existed. So the bishop comes to, the pawn comes to b5, chase the bishop comes to b3, and black castles. And white plays immediately c3 to preserve this bishop. This bishop, the so-called Spanish bishop, it's equally important in the Italian or Guico piano, but the Spanish bishop is a really important piece, and white takes steps to preserve that bishop by giving it a retreat square on c2. The pawn comes to d6, And the pawn comes to h3, the Kerry's variation. The knight attacks the bishop comes to c2, and the pawn comes to b5, c5, taking a grip on the d4 square. So d4 is now played whilst there's a chance. And instead of taking, the queen comes to c7. And this is now, after 11 moves, is the Chigorin defence. And I think it's just worth mentioning here that there are some variations in the Ruy Lopez or Spanish defence that don't get their name until 18 or 20 moves in. There is a tremendous amount of very deep theory in the Ruy Lopez, which is hardly surprising since it's the most commonly played opening in chess, always has been, and probably always will be the most commonly played opening in chess. But who knows what the future holds? Certainly not I. Anyway, the knight develops, yeah, and the bishop comes out to, yeah, take control over the d5 square. It's like saying to white, go on, play d5, because he wants to have that blocked. I'll even give you a tempo if you'll play d5. But he doesn't. He takes on e5 instead. And the knight comes to attack the bishop, and the bishop goes to d7. And whilst the bishop's on d7, he takes the opportunity to move the knight so that it doesn't gain a tempo by attacking the queen. But he comes to d8 to try and gain a tempo by attacking the queen, but the queen comes to e2, provides more defence for the pawn, and yeah, gets out of the way of this discovery from the bishop. Pawn comes to g6. Yeah, it's a common theme to play the pawn to g6 and play the rook to e8 and play the bishop to f8 and play the bishop to g7. A slow plan, but it's a common theme. I seem to remember complaining about this slow plan when I was analysing one of the Steinitz Chigorin games a few days ago. So, I don't change my habits so much. So the knight comes to e3. That was always the point in this development. The knight has been on a journey from b1, c2 to f1 to e3, and now might even be looking at some point in the future and coming to d5. The bishop comes to c8 specifically to fight against this d5 idea, so that black now has two attackers on the d5 square, so that if the knight comes to d5, knight takes, and if pawn takes, rook takes. So bishop c8 specifically directed against the d5. Right. And yeah, he's trying to, often both sides will look for a careful and controlled way to dissolve the pawns on the queen side in the Spanish game. And this is what happens now. The pawns are carefully dissolved. Now, you or I might well think, oh, I don't want to take with that queen, because if I take with the queen, he comes to d8 with the rook and chases my queen away, and why would I give him a tempo and give him control over that open file? But Barden thinks differently. He takes it anyway, and the rook does come to d8 and take control over the open file and gain a tempo on the queen. But yeah, one of the things about having control of an open file is that in order to exploit that control of the open file, one has to have an entry point. D1 is covered 3 times, D2 is covered twice, D3 is covered twice, D4 is covered once, but it's covered by a pawn, which is sufficient to chase the rook, and D5 is covered by the bishop and the knight. D6 is open, but if he plays the rook to D6, he's just getting in the way of his own bishop and his own queen. So even although he does get control of the open file, he doesn't gain much for that open file control in this situation. So Penrose goes to b4 to attack the pawn. Again, it's not so much about attacking the pawn or threatening to win the pawn, it's about dissolving in a safe manner the queenside pawns so that they can concentrate on playing on the king side. But Penrose, Barden just begins a wild sacrificial orgy, which partly based on the fact there's no entry point on the queen side, partly based on just the fact that the queen gets out to Siberia. So it sacrifices the exchange to start with, and of course he picks up the pawn on c4 and threatens now the pawn on f7. So Penrose defends the pawn, but he takes it anyway, and he's now threatening nasty discovered checks with the knight. So the king moves, thinking, okay, I'm getting out of those checks. But no, another sacrifice. The knight comes to f5. If he plays pawn takes, bishop takes, then he just plays pawn takes, and he hasn't really given up a great deal for it. He hasn't given up a piece for it. And then when the rook takes, yeah, okay, he might, but he takes the knight first anyway to get out of the check. And the bishop comes to h6 check, and he wins the bishop on f8 and is going to be able to get his piece back eventually. The knight comes to h8. What a fantastic idea, what a fantastic check. If the king comes to f7, g7 to attack the knight, then the queen comes to f7, forces the capture, takes the bishop, takes after that the bishop or the knight or whatever. Great, but he takes the bishop now because the king goes to h6, trying to avoid these checks. Now he comes to f7, and again the idea is that if he takes, knight takes here. So queen comes to a1 check, but the king finds safety on h2. The queen takes the pawn, but the bishop comes to b3, where it's safely defended by the bishop and where it's putting more pressure on the king side. Now again he's threatening to play queen to f7 check, and wherever he goes, then the king's going to be taken for, bishop's going to be taken first, and then the knight's going to be taken. So he makes himself an escape square by moving the pawn, but it doesn't do him any good because he takes, and he takes the knight, and he resigns. I thought he resigns because he's just going a piece down, but after carefully examining it, there is a mating sequence here. I think it might be mating 4, 5 or 6, something like that. I'm not going to tell you what the mating sequence is. Clearly you can switch on an engine and find it, but the best thing for your development as a chess player is to find the mating sequence for white in this game. Yeah, a fantastic achievement by Barden, a wonderful sacrificial game that seemingly came out of nowhere, and left Penrose reeling. So that was Leonard Barden, the world record holding chess columnist, proving that he wasn't just a writer, he was actually a very good player. Yeah, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.